Hello, everybody. This is Miss Peachy from your Wisconsin Connections Academy Biology B class. Today we are looking at Unit 4, Lesson 6, which is affecting carrying capacity. So we are now looking at what things affect carrying capacity. We did talk a little bit about these in the previous lesson. I actually kind of, embellished a little bit with what was in the lesson and talked about it kind of outside of the lesson. But we're going to go into greater detail here in today's lesson. Okay, so our key terms today are carrying capacity, community, direct competition, ecosystem, and population. Those are the terms that you should know for this lesson. And let's go ahead and look at our first regular slide. So just as a reminder, the carrying capacity of an ecosystem is the maximum number of individuals that can be supported at any given time. So, that's the first sentence essentially on this slide and just kind of giving you a reminder of what we learned in the previous lesson. I wanted to remind you of something real quick as well, and that is that if you click on the link below my video on my website here, don't forget to open up that study guide that I have here. This is with our key terms and a bunch of different questions that I think are relevant and important, kind of the key ideas here for this lesson. So first question I have is on here is, what kind of can contribute here to changes in the carrying capacity? And essentially there's lots of things, but the environment itself actually can contribute to a change in the carrying capacity. So let's think about that for a moment. Carrying capacity is the largest number of individuals that an ecosystem can support. If the ecosystem changes, that ecosystem might be able to support more or fewer organisms, right? For example, we have the example of the albatross sitting here on the shoreline. In this particular example that they give in the lesson, they're talking about actually changing the size of the ecosystem. If you go from a smaller ecosystem to a larger ecosystem, that the size of the actual ecosystem can actually change how many individuals can be supported on that particular sized ecosystem. And I think that makes some sense. That's pretty obvious. But there are other changes that I think are a lot more realistic. You're not going to just change the size of the ecosystem very easily, but there are other changes that can occur. For example, let's say there is a fire that ravishes an area and completely burns up a lot of the vegetation. And so then when the plant life starts to come back, there's a lot less of it than there was before. You usually end up with that kind of primary successional period where you have different types of plant life than you may have a little bit later. And so now the number of organisms that area can support is going to be considerably fewer than was there when the ecosystem was lush with vegetation. So that's a really realistic example of how some change, in this case a fire, changed the ecosystem so drastically that the carrying capacity of that ecosystem is going to go dramatically down, right? Or maybe alternately, you have a period of drought where you only have a certain number of deer, for example, that can be supported in this particular area because it's not been a lot of rainfall, and perhaps there's just very few a small amount of small vegetation. And then you get a lot of rain. And then plants are just coming up all over the place, right? And so now the alternative or the alternate is true. Now you've increased the carrying capacity of the region, in this case due to a change in climate. You have a drought period followed by a rainy period, so that can change the carrying capacity. So there's lots of different things that can alter the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. Here are some other examples. Both biotic, so examples of living things or living components, and abiotic factors. Availability of food, which I kind of alluded to there with the rainfall. Water supply, quality of the air, the temperature, availability of mates, or even competition from other species. So we are often talking about the carrying capacity of a single species. Let's say an invasive species comes into an ecosystem. A non-native species doesn't belong there and is outcompeting our native species in that area. They've introduced a level of competition and now they're outcompeting native species. And so the carrying capacity for the native species has gone down because there's an increase in competition that maybe wasn't there before. So all of these factors, some factors have a larger effect than others, it says, but just like the two islands, all of them work on a factor of scale. And the definition of factor of scale is the size of the ecosystem will have an impact on how much the abiotic or biotic factors will influence the carrying capacity. The smaller the ecosystem, the more dramatic a factor can influence the carrying capacity. So if you've got a very small ecosystem, you change something and it's probably going to have a bigger effect. The larger your ecosystem is, a smaller change will have a lesser effect because it's just by a ratio of size of the effect to size of the ecosystem. Smaller ecosystems, that effect has a much bigger impact. In biology, a multiplier is a factor that, when changed, causes changes in many other related biological variables. So some of these effects are multipliers. They actually can have even more effects going down the line. Let's say, for example, we talk about that invasive species comes in and it is out competing a native species for a competition of resources. Maybe that native species is a food source for another organism. And now, because it is now out competing the native species, it now essentially the numbers of the invasive species have gone up, but the numbers of the native species, which is its competitor, has gone down. And now that other organism that would eat the native has less food, so maybe its numbers go down, and it can have a compounding effect and affect multiple areas in that ecosystem because of one change to the ecosystem. And this can happen with lots of different things. You can imagine how maybe a change in temperature could have an effect on the flowering of a plant, which might be the food source for a particular type of insect, which then is a food source for a certain bird. And maybe those birds are actually predators, and as a result, another animals' numbers go way up because they're no longer being preyed upon, and then that's going to decimate the population of a different plant. So, I mean, it can really have a multitude of different effects on different levels. Let's see here. So, moving on to slide number 2, we talk about kind of those different levels of hierarchy within our living systems, and how each one of those different levels can affect the carrying capacity. So we have our individual, which is a single member of a species. We have the population, which is all members of the species within a given area. And then we have the community, which is literally all living things. All the living things that kind of live together in the same area. So when you have changes that occur on the level of the individual, the impact on the carrying capacity is pretty much none. However, when it becomes a populational change, that can cause a small to medium impact on carrying capacity. When you have a whole change in the community, then that can have a very large impact on the carrying capacity. So if it affects a multitude, the more organisms that it affects, the larger of an impact it's going to have on carrying capacity. Let's see here. The other kind of term here we have is direct competition. So, and we kind of just mentioned that with our invasive species. So at times, different species will have the same resource needs. For example, birds sometimes eat the same insects, or maybe we have, they live in the same trees. They have the same resource needs. It could be resources being food that they need, or space that they need, habitat, something like that. And the result is that they compete with each other. And so what happens is the result of competition is that one of the species will decrease in population size. So this is called direct competition, and actually there's a principle in ecology called the competitive exclusion principle, which really kind of illustrates this, that no two species that occupy the same biological niche can exist in the same area at the same time. One will always outcompete the other, and this leads to a reduction in the carrying capacity of that particular species, that it is losing that battle essentially. I'm just giving kind of an example here of, the individual versus the population versus the community. If a carrying capacity affects more than an individual or even a population, because communities are related, the carrying capacity of one species directly affects the carrying capacity of another. If a single giraffe dies, it will not have a strong effect on the population of giraffes or the community at large. If an entire population of giraffes die, it will affect the trees they eat from, the animals they compete with, the animals that eat the giraffes. The trees will have more leaves, allowing more food for elephants, but the giraffes are gone. There will be less food for lions, because the death of the entire population of giraffes affects the food source and carrying capacity of both elephants and lions. It affects the whole environment. So just kind of an illustration or an example of how the larger the impact, then the bigger effect it has on carrying capacity. So initially, when we see numbers of individuals in a population, we see what's known as exponential growth. As long as resources are plentiful and there's no competition, population can grow exponentially. The number of individuals will just get more and more and more over time. At some point, however, it reaches that flat spot here. We call that the carrying capacity, right? And this occurs when the population becomes too large and you have some factor that's limiting the size of the population. We call these limiting factors, actually. And those limiting factors are oftentimes dependent upon the population size itself. So some of them are space. They have to compete for where you're going to live. I mean, at some point you run out of space, and so the space itself is going to determine how many individuals can be in a population. For food, there's only so much food to go around. There's only so much water to go around. There's only so many mates to go around. So all of these things are kind of directly dependent upon the size of the population itself, and keeps that size of the population in check. And so it starts to stabilize and kind of hold true at that carrying capacity. And it pretty much stays at that carrying capacity unless some external factor changes. Something like a fire maybe happens and reduces the size of the carrying capacity, because now your resources are more scarce. Or maybe resources become more abundant because you have a nice warm period with lots of rainfall and stuff like that. So you see some rises and falls of the carrying capacity as the population will change, as the ecosystem itself kind of fluctuates naturally through changes. All right, so then we're kind of moving on to some questions that you need to go through on your own, and a video that you need to go through on your own. And then we finish off with a discussion of the monarch butterfly. Now, many of you guys know that I actually raise monarch butterflies in the summertime. Actually, I've done this every year for so many years, except for this past summer. I didn't get a chance to do this because we took a long vacation, and I didn't want to have to worry about anybody babysitting my monarchs when I was on vacation. But generally, I do raise these, and I do so because the monarch butterfly habitat is very much kind of an endangered thing, and the number of monarch butterflies has been going down. Monarchs actually, monarch caterpillars, I should say, are called dietary specialists. So what this means is they rely on a very specific food source in order to be able to survive. The monarch butterfly caterpillars, the larvae, they can only eat from the milkweed plant. So they have to have milkweed, and milkweed is a weed. It grows very abundantly. It's very once it's established, it actually spreads pretty well, but it can be difficult to get established sometimes. But the problem is that through growth in population and habitat destruction, we have been destroying a lot of the naturally occurring milkweed plants. So even though there's over 100 species of milkweed in North America, only about a fourth of them are acceptable hosts for most monarchs. So it's just talking a little bit about what a dietary specialist is and how changes to the population or changes to the environment for the monarch butterfly caterpillar, basically the reduction in the amount of milkweed, has led to lowering the carrying capacity for monarchs. And in fact, put them into, they're not technically considered an endangered species yet, but they are definitely threatened. And there's been a lot of people that have been, petitioning to get them listed as endangered species. Um, all right, I just want to correct myself because I just remembered that as of December 15th of 2020, so about a year from today, the monarch butterfly was actually listed as threatened, endangered, or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. I believe, and I would have to look this up, that the western monarch is considered to be endangered, and the eastern monarch, which is native to Wisconsin, is considered threatened. So it's not endangered. Western monarchs are more, um, there's fewer of them and they're reducing in size more rapidly. So they are, I think, don't quote me on this, considered to be endangered, and the eastern monarch is in threatened status. So I just wanted to correct myself on that because I know that just recently changed. All right, so that's everything today, you guys, from this lesson affecting the carrying capacity. So stay tuned. Tune in again for lesson 7. I will see you guys in that one. Have a wonderful day.